The chill isn't just in the air tonight. It's a quiet hum just beneath the surface. A whisper that reminds you some shadows stretch further than you think. Tonight, we gather around a different kind of fire. One that doesn't offer warmth, but instead illuminates the fragile line between the known and the unsettling. These are tales of what lingers, of the faint impressions left behind when something crosses over, or perhaps was always there. So, turn off the lights, settle in, and let the quiet dread find its way to you. Put on your headphones and let the outside world fade away. For the stories we share tonight aren't just fiction. They're echoes of something much older, much colder. The bonfire was always supposed to be a centerpiece, but that night, it felt like an altar. It had been built with meticulous care, logs stacked just so. A pyramid of dry wood designed to burn hot and long. I was 17, still living at home in a small town bordered by acres of national forest. Most weekends, my friends and I would find some secluded spot, haul out coolers and just hang out, letting off steam. This particular night, it was just Mark, Sarah, and me. We'd picked a clearing a good mile off the main trail, a place we'd used before, deep enough that nobody would bother us, hidden by dense pine and scrub oak. The air was cool, hinting at autumn, and the quiet was almost physical. Mark, always the pyromaniac of the group, got the fire going with a single match, coaxing the kindling until it caught. The flames started small, hesitant, then greedily licked up the dry wood. We sat on fallen logs, sharing a bag of chips and lukewarm sodas, talking about school and stupid crushes. It was all so normal, so utterly forgettable, that I almost missed the first odd thing. As the fire grew, the smoke, instead of rising straight up or drifting with the gentle breeze, seemed to swirl inward on itself, forming a tighter column than usual. It was almost like a dark, smoky corkscrew, twisting up into the night sky, fighting against the natural air currents. I pointed it out to Mark, thinking maybe he'd built the fire wrong. He just shrugged, said maybe it was the way the wind was eddying through the trees. Sarah didn't even look up from her phone, but I kept watching it, mesmerized. It wasn't just drifting, it was spinning, a slow, deliberate rotation that felt too uniform to be accidental. And then, as the flames grew taller, brighter, the smoke column seemed to darken, becoming almost solid, a void in the starlit sky. It looked less like smoke and more like a black ribbon being pulled straight up into something unseen, unheard. It was unsettling, but not truly frightening yet. Just weird. As the night wore on, the fire settled into a roaring inferno, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched into the tree line. We tossed in more logs, keeping it fed, enjoying the warmth. That's when the second thing happened. A large, partially burnt log, one of the bigger ones at the base of the stack, slowly, almost imperceptibly, slid forward from its position. It wasn't pushed by another log falling, nor did it simply roll. It shifted inch by inch, as if someone had nudged it from underneath, bringing its glowing, charred end closer to the edge of the pit. We all noticed it, and Mark even gave it a tentative poke with a stick, muttering about settling wood, but it felt deliberate, like it was trying to get out. The log didn't move any further after Mark poked it, but the air around us seemed to grow heavy, the quiet deepening beyond what was natural for a forest at night. The usual rustling of leaves or the chirping of crickets faded away, leaving only the crackle of the fire. Then came the whispers, faint, breathy sounds, like dry leaves skittering across the ground, or distant voices carried on a breeze that wasn't there. They weren't distinct words, just an indistinct murmur that seemed to come from the darkest parts of the woods, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Sarah hugged her knees, pulling her jacket tighter. Mark's eyes darted around, his casual bravado replaced by a tense silence. I tried to rationalize it, attributing it to the wind, or maybe just the sound of the fire itself playing tricks on our ears. but the whispers felt too close, and they seemed to respond subtly to the intensity of the flames. When the fire briefly flared after we threw on another log, the whispers intensified, almost like a sigh. Mark grabbed his phone, using the flashlight to sweep the tree line, but there was nothing there, just the impenetrable darkness. Each time the beam passed over a patch of woods, the whispers seemed to recede from that spot, only to pick up again behind us, or further to the side, always just out of reach, always just out of sight. Then the fire itself changed. It wasn't just burning, it was pulsing. The embers at the base began to glow with an unnatural intensity, throbbing with a soft, rhythmic light, almost like a slow heartbeat. With each pulse, the shadows around us would deepen and recede, as if the forest was breathing with the fire. The heat felt oppressive, even though the air was still cool, and the whispers seemed to weave themselves into the pulse. A low, guttural thrumming that was almost felt more than heard. It was as if the fire was no longer just a fire, but a mouth, and it was speaking to something, or something was speaking through it. A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Sarah was openly scared now, her face pale in the firelight. Mark had stopped sweeping with his phone and was just staring, wide-eyed, at the fire. The log that had shifted earlier, the half-burnt one, began to move again. Slowly, agonizingly, it pulled itself further out of the pit, dragging its glowing end across the scorched earth, leaving a trail of ash and sparks. It moved like an unseen hand was guiding it, not rolling but sliding, as if it had an intention. It stopped just at the very edge of the clearing, its glowing end pointing directly into the darkest part of the woods, towards where the whispers seemed thickest. The pulsing of the embers grew faster, more frantic. We didn't say a word. We just watched, frozen, as the fire suddenly, without warning, began to die. Not slowly, but as if someone had pressed a button. The flames shriveled, collapsed inward, and in seconds were gone, leaving only the intensely throbbing embers. And then, the embers themselves began to fade, the pulsing light growing weaker, dimmer, until they were just dull red coals, barely visible. As the light faded, the whispers grew louder, clearer, no longer indistinct, but a chorus of low, guttural sounds that seemed to fill the clearing. They weren't speaking words we understood, but they were definitely speaking, and they sounded hungry, like 1,000 voices whispering from every direction, all around us. We didn't need to discuss it. The three of us bolted, scrambling over logs, tripping on roots, the sounds of the forest suddenly alive with menacing rustles and snaps that had nothing to do with us. We didn't stop until we hit the gravel road, breathless and shaking. We never looked back. To this day, none of us have ever talked about it properly. It's an unspoken agreement. We just know something answered that fire, something that had been waiting in the dark. We never went back to that clearing, never built another bonfire. But sometimes, when I hear the wind just right, or when I see a fire burning low in a neighbor's yard, I swear I can still hear those whispers, just at the edge of hearing, and I remember the pulsing embers waiting for something to reach out. Sometimes, the embers don't just fade. They hold a memory, a lingering warmth that hints at something more substantial than ash. And sometimes that memory isn't yours to keep. The quiet places often remember best, long after we've forgotten what we saw in the fading light. The smoke from the bonfire always drifted east, towards the old, overgrown trail that nobody used. That was just how the wind worked, especially up in the mountains. We'd bought this cabin a few years back, a small, rustic place tucked away deep in the Adirondacks, far from any real town. I was 17 that summer, spending a good chunk of my vacation up there alone, mostly just reading and enjoying the quiet. My parents trusted me. I'd been coming up here since I was a kid. It was usually peaceful, the kind of quiet that lets you hear every rustle in the leaves. But that summer, the quiet started to feel different, thicker, somehow like it was holding its breath. Every night I'd build a bonfire. It was a ritual almost, something about the crackle and the warmth against the cool mountain air. Plus, it kept the bugs away. I'd sit out there for hours, just watching the flames dance, thinking about nothing in particular. The cabin was basic, no internet, spotty cell service. So the fire was my entertainment, my connection to something primal. I always made sure to let it burn down to embers before heading inside, dousing it thoroughly. It's fire safety, obviously, but there was also a quiet satisfaction in seeing the last wisps of smoke curl up into the vast, dark sky. The stars out there, away from city lights, were incredible. The first odd thing happened maybe a week in. I was sitting by the fire, late, the flames starting to die down. I heard something, a faint whisper, like someone trying to talk just beyond the tree line. It was too quiet to make out words, just a soft, drawn-out sibilance. I froze, listening. Could be an animal, I told myself. A fox, or maybe the wind playing tricks. The woods out there were dense, and sound traveled weirdly. I've heard deer make surprisingly human-like sounds before. I grabbed a stick, poking at the embers, trying to make some noise to assert my presence. The whispering stopped, and I eventually convinced myself it was nothing. Just my imagination. A few nights later, it was undeniably strange. I had my usual bonfire going, a good, strong blaze. The wind was definitely blowing east, a steady, cool breeze. I watched the smoke, as I always did, expecting it to stream towards that old trail. But it didn't. It drifted north, straight up, then south, then west, circling around the clearing before finally settling on an eastbound path. It moved almost like it was being guided, not by the wind, but by some unseen hand. It wasn't a sudden gust. It was a slow, deliberate movement. I stared at it, trying to find a logical explanation. Air currents, temperature differences, anything. But it felt wrong, like the smoke itself was alive, searching. The next evening, I decided to test it almost on a whim. I built a smaller fire than usual, just a few logs. As the smoke started to rise, I quietly asked, out loud, "Is anyone out there?" The words felt stupid as soon as they left my mouth. It was just a fire. But then, the smoke, which had been gently curling upwards, suddenly shifted. It didn't just change direction. It swirled, like a miniature tornado, directly towards the cabin door, then dissolved. It was quick, unsettling. My heart hammered. I stood up, walked around the fire, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. It had to be a coincidence, a fluke. But the feeling of being watched was intense. I tried to ignore it, but the unease settled in. I started building bigger fires almost subconsciously, like the bigger the flames, the more protection they offered. One night, I was lost in thought, staring into the heart of the blaze. The logs had burned down, leaving a bright, orange glow. For a split second, I saw it. Not a face, not a full figure, but a distinct impression. A dark, elongated shape within the brightest part of the fire, like a negative space against the intense heat. It was fleeting, gone as soon as I registered it, but the impression of something tall, thin, and impossibly still was burned into my mind. I stumbled back from the fire, almost tripping over my own feet. After that, I couldn't enjoy the fires anymore. Every time I lit one, I felt a prickle on my neck, like I was being observed from the woods. The whispers returned, more distinct this time, still too faint for words, but with a definite cadence, a rise and fall that sounded like speech. It wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to drift from all around the clearing. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, rustling leaves, all seemed to quiet down whenever I had a fire going. It was like the forest itself held its breath, waiting. The silence was the worst part, a heavy, oppressive quiet that amplified every tiny sound, every crackle of the fire. The final night, I built a massive fire, almost out of defiance. I was leaving the next morning. As the flames reached their peak, the smoke poured into the sky. And then it happened. The smoke didn't just drift. It coalesced. Right above the highest point of the flames, against the dark backdrop of the trees, a hand formed. It was smoky, ethereal, but unmistakably a hand. Long, slender fingers, reaching, stretching, and then slowly curling, like it was beckoning. It moved deliberately, not in a chaotic, wind-blown way. It lasted for a solid 10 seconds, a silent, impossible invitation, before slowly dissipating back into formless gray. I couldn't move. I just stared, my mouth dry. I ran inside, locked every door and window, and didn't sleep a wink. I left the cabin at first light, not even bothering to pack everything. I told my parents I just got bored of being alone. I never told them about the smoke or the whispers or the hand. I haven't been back to that cabin since. My parents still go, but I always make an excuse. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I'd answered that smoky hand. What it wanted. But I never will. And I don't light bonfires anymore, not even in my own backyard. Just in case the smoke still remembers how to answer. The air can thicken with more than just smoke. There are presences that don't need a voice to be felt. Only a certain stillness. A quiet understanding that you are not alone in the vast, dark spaces. What answers you might not be what you called for. The smoke detector in the living room had a habit of chirping exactly 3 times every hour on the hour, even with fresh batteries. It was a quirk of the old house my family bought when I was 22. A fixer-upper on the outskirts of Flagstaff. We were trying to save money, and my parents thought it would be a good bonding experience, tackling renovations together. I just finished college, hadn't landed a proper job yet, so I was stuck helping them. Most nights, after a day of scraping paint or hauling drywall, I'd be out on the back patio, staring at the distant mountains, the air cool and thin, just trying to unwind. Our first big project was clearing the overgrown backyard. It was a wilderness of dead bushes and fallen branches. So we started a bonfire every evening to burn off the debris. It felt primal, sitting by the flames as the sun dipped, watching the sparks climb into the darkening sky. Dad always made sure the fire was contained, a ring of stones, a hose nearby. I usually handled the tending, poking at the logs, making sure everything burned down to ash. It was oddly satisfying, that slow reduction, the way the heat radiated against the cool desert night. One Tuesday, about a week into the bonfire routine, I was out there alone. My parents had gone to bed early, exhausted. The fire was settling, mostly glowing embers now, when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible rustle from the dense, uncleared part of our yard, beyond the main fire pit. It wasn't the sound of an animal, not a deer or a rabbit. It was too deliberate, like something dragging lightly through dry leaves. I paused, poker in hand, listening. The wind was barely a whisper. I told myself it was just a stray branch falling, the settling of the old house, anything but what my gut was starting to suggest. I shrugged it off, stirred the embers, and just as I was about to head inside, I saw it again. A flicker, deep in the shadows at the very edge of our property, where the scrub brush became a small patch of untouched forest. Not a shadow moving, but a shape. Too tall, too still to be an animal. It seemed to be watching the fire. My heart started to beat a little faster. It looked like a person standing unnaturally still. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded thin and shaky in the vast quiet. The shape didn't move, didn't answer. It just stood there, observing. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight we kept by the back door, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the yard towards where I'd seen the figure. Nothing. Just trees, bushes, and shadows. My mind immediately jumped to local teenagers messing around. Maybe someone lost. But the way it had been standing, so utterly motionless, was unsettling. I waited, holding my breath, the flashlight fixed on the spot. Minutes crawled by. The only sounds were the crackle of the dying fire and the distant drone of cicadas. The hair on my arms was standing up, a primitive warning. I knew deep down it wasn't a kid. I decided to test it. I slowly turned my back to the dark edge of the yard, pretending to poke at the fire again, watching the reflection in the glass of the sliding patio door. And there it was. The figure had moved closer, much closer, barely 50 feet from the fire now, just at the tree line. It was taller than any person I knew, unnaturally slender, and still, always still. It wasn't observing the fire anymore. It was observing me. A shiver ran down my spine, cold despite the heat of the embers. It was waiting, I realized, waiting for me to leave, or worse, waiting for an invitation. I backed away slowly, never fully turning my back to the darkness, until I was inside, locking the sliding door with shaking hands. I watched through the glass, the figure still there, unmoving. The bonfire, now just a bed of glowing coals, seemed to pulse. Then, I heard it, a sound that wasn't possible. A low, dry whispering, like rustling leaves, but it was coming from the embers themselves. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I knew. It was just a sound, a suggestion of words, curling out of the fire, beckoning. The figure in the darkness didn't move an inch, but I knew it was listening, too. I ran upstairs to my bedroom, pulling the curtains tight, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. I pressed my face to the glass, peering out a tiny gap. The figure was gone. The fire pit was just a dark circle now. I told myself it was over, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the isolated quiet of the new house. But then, as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, I heard it again. That low, dry whispering. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was faint, barely audible, but it was coming from somewhere inside the house. From the living room right below me, where the smoke detector chirped. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, listening to the house creak, to my parents' soft snores, and to that faint, impossible whisper. The smoke detector never chirped again. Not once. We've replaced it, of course, bought a brand new, expensive one. But the silence where those 3 chirps used to be is somehow louder, heavier than any noise. We still have bonfires sometimes. My parents think it's a great way to clear the yard. I just watch the flames and I listen. I listen for the rustle, for the whisper, for the presence that I know is still out there, just beyond the reach of the light, always waiting for the embers to invite it in. You tend to the familiar, the everyday, believing it offers a shield against the unknown. But sometimes, the heart of your home holds secrets, and the very ground you stand on has an older, deeper memory. What you protect may also be watching you back. The small fire in our backyard pit crackled, but the smoke, instead of rising, seemed to drift sideways, clinging low to the damp grass. I was 19 that summer, home from my first year of college, feeling a weird mix of bored and restless in my parents' suburban house. Most nights, I'd just scroll on my phone, but a few evenings, when the air was cool and still, I'd build a small fire just for the sake of it. It was a simple, comforting ritual, watching the flames dance, thinking about nothing in particular. That particular night, though, felt different. A heavy quiet had settled over the neighborhood, muffling even the distant hum of the highway. I'd been burning some old lumber scraps from a shed repair, and the wood smoke usually had a sweet, resinous smell. But tonight, there was an undertone, something acrid and metallic, like old pennies or burnt electronics. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the clean wood smoke, but it made me wrinkle my nose. I walked around the pit, trying to trace the source, thinking maybe some strange plastic had gotten mixed in with the wood. I checked the ground, poked at the embers, but saw nothing unusual. It was just a weird smell, I told myself, probably just the damp air playing tricks. My parents' house sits on a corner lot, and our backyard borders 2 neighbors. To the left, the Millers, an older couple who were away for the month. Their house was dark, silent. To the right, the Davidsons, a family with 2 kids around my age, but their house was equally still. I squinted into the gloom, trying to make out if any lights were on, but it was just a dark shape against the darker sky. Then I saw it, or thought I did. A figure standing perfectly still, right at the edge of the Miller's yard, partially obscured by their overgrown hedge. Too tall for one of the Davidson kids, too rigid for an animal. My heart gave a little thump. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, it was gone. Just the dark outline of the hedge and the silent house. It must have been a trick of the shadows, the way the moonlight fell through the oak branches, creating an illusion. I tried to dismiss it, but an uneasy feeling began to prickle at the back of my neck. I poked the fire, sending sparks spiraling upwards, trying to recapture the mundane comfort of the moment. But I kept glancing back at the hedge, feeling a strange weight, as if I was being watched, not just by the darkness, but by something within it, something that didn't blink. As the fire dwindled, a large, stubborn piece of oak heartwood remained, glowing with an intense, steady heat. It was fascinating, a miniature sun in the pit. I leaned closer, mesmerized by the deep, pulsing orange. And that's when I noticed it. Not in the flame, but within the deepest part of the glowing ember itself. A tiny, almost imperceptible flicker, like a pinprick of green light, too consistent to be just the wood's natural minerals. It was subtle, but it didn't move or waver like a normal ember. It just held, a steady, unblinking point of emerald within the orange. It was like an eye, watching me from the heart of the wood. I stared at it, my breath held. The green pinpoint winked out, then reappeared, slightly brighter, almost shimmering. A tendril of smoke, thicker and darker than the rest, detached itself from the fire and began to drift, not upwards, but directly towards me, snaking low across the grass. It wasn't a strong breeze, barely a ripple in the air, but the smoke curved and coiled with purpose. As it reached me, I caught that metallic, acrid smell again, much stronger this time, and I could have sworn I heard a faint, sibilant whisper in the air, just at the edge of hearing, like dry leaves rustling, or a distant voice trying to form words. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose paver. The smoke dissipated, and the green light in the ember vanished. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. I grabbed the hose, drenched the pit, and didn't stop until the last hiss of steam died out. I ran inside, locked the door, and went straight to my room, pulling the blinds tight. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, my imagination running wild. But as I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I heard it again. That whisper. And this time it was clearer. Not words, not exactly, but a distinct intonation, a cadence I recognized. It was the way my grandmother used to hum when she was knitting, a specific, almost tuneless melody that only she ever made. My grandmother had passed away 2 years prior. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was just a memory or the wind, but the memory of that green light, that metallic smell, wouldn't leave me. The next morning I was still shaken. I went downstairs, poured a coffee, and glanced at the framed photos on the mantelpiece. And that's when the blood ran cold. The small, silver-framed photo of my grandmother, a smiling portrait from her 70th birthday, was gone. Just an empty space, a faint dust outline on the wood. I checked everywhere, frantic. Under the couch, behind other pictures, even in the trash. It was just gone. No sign of forced entry, nothing else disturbed. My parents were still asleep. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. How a small, almost imperceptible green light in a bonfire had somehow taken it, or acknowledged it. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I just sat in my room listening. The house was utterly silent, but I felt a presence, a watchful stillness that pressed in from the dark outside. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something had answered my fire, and it wasn't benign. I moved back to college 2 weeks early. I couldn't stay in that house. I never built another bonfire. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, late at night, and I hear a faint, almost inaudible rustle, like dry leaves, or that specific tuneless hum, I wonder. I wonder what exactly I invited, what exactly saw me through that ember. And sometimes, in the dead quiet, I hear it. A whisper, just my name, spoken in a voice that sounds exactly like my grandmother's, but with an echo that belongs to something far, far older than any human memory. And I know, with absolute certainty, it's not her. These stories, like all good ghost stories, aren't just about what goes bump in the night. They're about the things that resonate within us, the primal fears that remind us how thin the veil truly is. They linger long after the telling, a cold spot in the warmth, a shadow at the edge of your vision. It's the unease that stays with you, the subtle shift in perspective that makes your own quiet home feel just a little bit different. If you seek more tales that peel back the comfortable layers of reality, consider joining Scareverse for a new story every week.